Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm talking about whether or not your employer can force you to have the COVID-19 vaccine. But first of all, if you're just joining our legal community, don't forget to like this video if you find it useful, subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos, and make sure you hit that bell icon. That gives you notifications when I release a new video. So I think we're at a real tipping point right now with the COVID vaccine because 38.6 million people have had their first dose. 24 million people have had their second dose, giving a total of 62,658,639 vaccines given at the time of recording. But according to Peninsula, studies show that 30% of adults could refuse to take a vaccine. So before long, we're going to get close to that position, and it's important for you to know whether your employer can force you to have a vaccine or not. As usual, I'm going to start with the bottom line summary, and that is twofold. First of all, of course, your employer cannot physically hold you down and inject you with the vaccine against your will. This would be a serious assault with criminal liability, and I hope it goes without saying that they simply cannot do that. Secondly, there is also no law that provides that your employer can force you to have a vaccine. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any consequences. So the basic position is that your employer cannot forcibly give you a vaccine, and they cannot order you to have a vaccine legally, although there might be consequences, which we're going to come on to now. Now, because the position we're in is fairly unprecedented, and employment tribunals take around a year or so or more to actually get to tribunal to make a decision, even longer if those decisions are appealed, so that there's an authoritative appeal decision on any given point, all we can really do at the moment is say what sort of things these tribunals are going to look at if, and no doubt when, they look at unfair dismissal claims, for example, because someone's refused to take a COVID vaccine. So let's run through some of those now. Now again, just to stress, this is not legal advice. I'm just running through a couple of scenarios for you to think about when you do go and seek formal advice if you need to. So let's take the scenario that your employer has said that you must take the vaccine, else you'll be dismissed, but you simply don't want to take the vaccine for any of a number of reasons, which I will come back to later in the video. So let's say you've refused to take the vaccine and your employer dismisses you. Now, in all but the rarest of occasions, there isn't anything you can do to actually prevent yourself from being dismissed. Your employer can dismiss you, it will be effective, but then it may be open to you to explore potential claims either for discrimination or for unfair dismissal. So looking at the fairly broad heading of discrimination, first of all, under the Equality Act, your employer cannot treat you any differently for any reason that is linked to or based on any of the protected characteristics. And those protected characteristics are set out in Section 4 of the Equality Act 2010, and they are as follows: age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex, and sexual orientation. And I would add that this would be anything that would be linked to any of these characteristics. Under this heading, and by way of example, if you are a disabled person and you have a genuine medical concern that the vaccine is going to affect you or your disability or any of the medications you are on, for example, then this could be something that you could seek legal advice on. If, on the other hand, there were religious grounds to refuse the vaccine, this would also come under a protected characteristic as well. But it's worth mentioning at this point that there is broad support for the COVID vaccine from various different faith groups, and there are independent statements published that you can see online. I will link to some of them below. There is also a very useful fact sheet produced by the NHS addressing various different faiths, and I will link that in the description as well, so you can take a look at that. If you are or were in the age group that hasn't yet had the rollout of the vaccine and your employer has dismissed you because you haven't had the vaccine, this may well come under the head of age under a protected characteristic, because in that scenario it's possible that you've been treated differently because of your age. In other words, if somebody older than you has had the vaccine because they're in the age group that has been in the rollout, whereas you haven't and you've been dismissed, then there's an arguable case that you've been treated differently because of your age. This would come under the protected characteristic of age. That is obviously not an exhaustive discussion for every eventuality under the head of discrimination or protected characteristics. Just to give you an idea of how those things might be engaged in the coming months and years if you've been dismissed for refusing or being unable to take the vaccine at a specific time. But it's very important to say that unless there are specific circumstances that link to any one of those protected characteristics, then simple refusal or delay or unwillingness or not wanting to take the vaccine in and of itself is not going to amount to a discrimination claim because it won't be linked to any protected characteristic. So unwillingness, not wanting to, or delaying to take the vaccine, those are not going to come under this head of claim, unless, as I've said, they are linked to a protected characteristic under specific circumstances. This is why you must seek formal legal advice if you think any of these might apply. Moving on to a different type of employment claim you may have heard of called unfair dismissal. This will kick in if you've had continuous employment with your employer for a period of 2 years or more. So unfortunately, if there are no heads under a discrimination claim and you've only worked for your employer for a period of less than 2 years, you are not going to have a claim for unfair dismissal. You may be able to claim against your employer for unpaid notice if they haven't paid you notice within your contract for that period of time, but that would be a separate claim, and again you'd need to seek legal advice on that to see what your contract says about notice, pay, how much pay you're entitled to, what pay you're entitled to, and so on. So broadly speaking, an unfair dismissal claim is where the dismissal is considered to be unfair in all of the circumstances. So obviously in unprecedented times, there are lots of different circumstances going on all at the same time. There may well be scenarios where employers are changing their contracts of employment with their employees, inserting a term that requires them to have this particular or any particular vaccine. This is probably a risky strategy, and I would firmly urge any employer who's watching this video considering doing that to seek formal and robust legal advice before doing so. On the other hand, it may well be less of a risk to insert this term for new contracts, for new starters, but again, I would suggest going to an employment specialist to sit down to go through the exact wording of any such terms that you think of including in those contracts. Or if you are the employee, you are entitled as well to seek legal advice on an employment contract that you are asked to sign. As with any other contract, I would never advise anybody to sign a contract without reading, of course. But most people don't realize that you can get legal advice on practically anything that you desire, even on behalf of someone else. So if you are presented with an employment contract and there is a term in there that requires you to have the vaccine or a particular vaccine, and you are against it for any particular reason, then again, you can seek legal advice on that and refer to any of the things that I've said in this video, but taking it as formal legal advice from your lawyer. There is some reassurance in this particular aspect in that the Justice Secretary has made an announcement that it could be possible to insert these terms for new starters. But again, just to refer back to discrimination elements, if you were to insert this term as an absolute mandatory requirement in your new contracts of employment and certain age groups are not yet eligible for a vaccine, this may amount to age discrimination again, so be mindful of it and take formal advice on the exact wording. So thinking about all of the circumstances, consideration of which will determine whether or not a dismissal was fair, following refusal to take a vaccine, for example. Obviously, the working environment, the nature of the work, the number of people, the way the work is conducted, where the work is conducted, all of these sorts of things are going to have an impact. For example, care homes, conceivably any type of medical facility, even children's nurseries, each of these places are going to have a unique set of circumstances, and all of those circumstances will be considered in the event that an employee refuses to have a vaccine, is dismissed, and then brings an unfair dismissal claim. I think it's also important to mention that employers should be implementing reasonable steps and alternative protections, particularly if any of the staff have medical disabilities or vulnerabilities and perhaps cannot take a vaccine but remain extremely vulnerable to the spread of disease, and the employer really should be taking steps and measures to limit all of the risks to each employee. So whilst the law doesn't require you to take a vaccine, I have another video discussing that point, I'll link below. and your employer cannot legally or physically force you to have a vaccine. Employers should be open about their vaccination policy with you, encourage you to take the vaccine where it's safe and appropriate to do so, and they should be taking all steps possible to protect those that cannot or do not take a vaccination. So as I said at the outset, I think we're approaching this tipping point now, notwithstanding the new variants flying around, where 42% of people are yet to have a vaccine, but apparently studies show that 30% of adults are going to refuse to take a vaccine, and we'll need to see how that pans out at that time. But as always, if you are in any doubt about anything, please read the official sources of information, not what you read in comments or from a neighbor, a friend, or anyone else. Take it from official sources, and if you need legal advice, you don't rely on this video or any other video or what anyone else says in the comments. You go and sit down with a lawyer who can discuss your particular scenario and tailor their advice to your individual set of circumstances. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe if you found this useful. Give it a big thumbs up. Join me over at Black Belt Secrets if you've got other types of questions you'd like me to address for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.